As I listen to the radio from time to time, I discover an argument against the Sabbath that I believe is either a failure to study or an outright lie. I don't know which it is. Probably some people know better, but they tell the lie because it supports their view. Others may really think it's true, but they never bothered to really check it out. And that is that we need to keep 9 commandments because in the New Testament it never talks about the Sabbath. It only talks about the other 9 commandments. So the Sabbath then has been changed to Sunday, and they feel that proves it because there's no evidence in the New Testament. So today we're going to look and see, are they right about that or not? In Luke chapter 4, verse 16, we read, "And he," which is Jesus, "and Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read." I should mention this too. In the Bible, the word Sabbath is used frequently. It never means Sunday. When it's talking about Sunday, it calls it the first day. So here, obviously, it's telling us that Jesus always kept the seventh-day Sabbath. Someone might say, well, but he was Jewish, and this is before the cross and the resurrection, so that doesn't count. But we have to remember, Jesus was not only human, but he was divine. He knew that the Israelite nation, or the Jewish, which was the leftover from the Israelite nation, he knew that they would not turn to him and that their probation would close and that he would have to start the Christian church. And so it was not only his custom because he was a Jew, but it was his custom because he was going to be setting up the Christian church. And just to help us tip the scale in that direction, we look in Acts chapter 17, verse 2, and it says, "And Paul, as his manner was." Now they translate that a different word, but it's got the exact same meaning. As his manner was. In other words, Paul always went to church on Sabbath, the 7th day of the week. "And Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the Scriptures." And we're going to trace a little bit in a few moments some of the occasions that are mentioned in the Bible when Paul went to church on Sabbath. In Luke 23, verses 54 to 6, we have another very important mention of Sabbath. It says, "That day was the preparation." In other words, Jesus died on Friday, which the Jews called the preparation day to get ready for the Sabbath. That day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew on. And the women also, which came with him from Galilee, followed after, and beheld the sepulchre and how his body was laid. So they watched Jesus being taken down from the cross, and they followed to his grave. And they returned and prepared spices and ointments and rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. Now notice the wording. They were keeping the 4th commandment by not taking the spices back on that occasion, but waiting until the seventh day was finished. Now there's some other evidence from this text that's not looked into too often, but the New Testament was written from 30 to 40 years after Jesus ascended back to heaven. The early Christian church based their entire teaching on what they remembered about what Jesus said and from the Old Testament. That's all they had until about 30 or 40 years later. Now, if you were a writer of this particular text in Luke, and Luke was a researcher, he wasn't one of the disciples, but he went around asking people that knew, and he put it down. If Jesus had changed the day of worship, wouldn't you think you should put a footnote in there and say, but when Jesus arose from the grave, he told us that we should keep Sunday? Wouldn't you feel you had to put that in there? Otherwise, people are going to read it and say, well, we're supposed to keep the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week, because it clearly says the reason they didn't go back to Jesus' tomb is because it was the Sabbath. And they kept it according to the commandment. There's a text that has a real bearing on this in Malachi 3, verse 6. This is God saying something about himself. He says, for I am the Lord. There's nobody else. I'm the only one. And because I am the Lord, I don't have to change. I don't give one day of worship in the Old Testament and a different one in the New. I don't change. Now, there are some things that we say changed, but if we really studied enough, we would see that he planned for it to change from the beginning. In other words, the feast days and the sacrifice of animals and all that, from the very beginning he planned to change that. He didn't come along and say, we're going to have to change this. He is a God that doesn't change. He knows the end from the beginning. He makes a plan and he never has to change it. Another interesting fact, which isn't considered, is that there's only one full day that Jesus was in the tomb. Now, it said he would be in the heart of the earth 3 days, like Jonah was in the whale 3 days, but he only spent one full day in the tomb, and that was on the Sabbath. So when he finished creation, he rested. When he finished redemption, as far as the sacrifice is concerned, when his life had been lived and he had made the sacrifice, he rested again on the Sabbath day. So this text is obviously calling for the Christian church to keep the seventh day of the week. Some more general ones, and we could get dozens of these, but I'm just going to read a few. Jesus said, if ye love me, keep my commandments. Now let me say this. When Jesus instructs us to keep the commandments, he is not suggesting that we can do it in our own power. He is simply saying, if you let me live in your heart, you will be able to obey my commands. Because what I did once in my own humanity, I can do again in your humanity. And therefore you can keep the commandments. So he gives the command with that background that I am there to help you keep the commandments, and I expect you to keep it if you love me. If you don't love me, don't bother to keep my commandments. It won't mean anything anyway. That's the opposite way of putting it. And also, he made this very plain statement in Matthew 5, verses 17 to 19. Think not that I am come to destroy the law. I don't know if you've ever seen these signs about no parking. They have a variety of them, but the one that caught my eye was, don't even think of parking here. That's the message Jesus is saying here. Don't even think that I came to change the law. Or the prophets. That's like saying, I didn't come to change the writings of Moses. I didn't come to change the rest of the prophets of the Old Testament. The New Testament does not change the Old Testament. If it did, we'd have to throw it out because it could only be put in the Bible when it agreed with what was already the inspired writings. He said, I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. And oh boy, they get tripped up on that word, fulfill. But in this context, it's saying demonstrate. Jesus is saying, I came to show you how a person lives when they keep the law. I came to fill it full, not to fulfill it in the sense of now we can throw it out, but in the sense that I am putting on a demonstration of what it's like to keep the law. And therefore, if we simply do what Jesus did, we'll be safe. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law. Now that's the smallest part that you could see. In our language, we'd call it a crossing of the T or the dotting of the I. That's not what it means, but it's the smallest characters in their language. And he's saying, I didn't come to change even the smallest part of those 10 commandments. Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments, and there's really none that are little, but he says if whichever one you think is the least important, whosoever shall break that one and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. And they think, well, they're going to still get to heaven. That's not what it's talking about. In this text, it's talking about heaven and earth, all of the beings, and there's a lot of people that are never going to get out of this old world. They're going to die right here. And so those who teach others that you don't need to keep the commandments have a very dark future ahead of them. And Jesus warned them not to do that. And then James, who was the first General Conference president, here's what he said under inspiration, James 2:10. For whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend in one point is guilty of all. So if someone breaks the Sabbath, they are taking another god, they are worshiping an image, they are swearing, and they are not honoring their parents, and on down through all the 10 commandments if they do not keep the Sabbath. Or any other of the commandments, they are literally breaking all of them. Now this one they really get tripped up on as well because they're not really looking carefully. In Revelation 1:10 it says, John was speaking, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. And they make an assumption. The resurrection is the Lord's day. But you have to find it in the Bible. If the Bible doesn't call the resurrection day the Lord's day, it's not the Lord's day. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day and heard behind me a great voice as of a trumpet. Well, if we look for which is the Lord's day, We find it in Mark chapter 2, verses 27 and 28. And he said unto them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. In other words, the Sabbath was not given to show God's authority, although it does show his authority. But the reason he gave us the Sabbath is because it would be a great benefit to us. It would be a tremendous blessing to us. And so he gave us the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is the Lord's day. As we put those two texts together, we understand that John was banished to an island, this rocky island. There may have been some other people living there. There is today a few people living there on that rocky island. But I doubt there was any church there. He couldn't go to church on Sabbath. And so he had to spend the day by himself. And one day, as he was sitting there keeping the Sabbath like all the other apostles did, all of a sudden, the Holy Spirit spoke to him and gave him these visions that he recorded in the book of Revelation. Now let's look at a few of the times when the early Christian church got together. This first one is in Antioch, and it's found in Acts 13, verse 14, and then we'll skip down to 42 to 44. They came to Antioch in Pisidia and went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and sat down. So someone says, yeah, the reason that he went to church on Sabbath was because it was a Jewish synagogue. Well, there's some truth in that. Paul said very clearly, the Jew first and then the Gentile. So anytime he goes to a city, the first place he goes is to try to help the Jews. He usually got thrown out after a while, but he tried to help the Jews. And when the Jews were gone out of the synagogue, so now the Jews have all left, the Gentiles besought that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. They didn't say, we know that you keep Sunday, so could you come back tomorrow and preach to us tomorrow? No, they said, please come back, but next Sabbath preach to us. Now, when the congregation was broken up, many of the Jews and religious proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who, speaking to them, persuaded them to continue in the grace of God. So some of them couldn't wait, and he tried to help them during the week as well to understand it. But then it comes to the next Sabbath. And the next Sabbath day came almost the whole city together to hear the word of God. And they came on Sabbath because they knew that's the day that they would hear the word of God preached. Now this next one, there is no synagogue. In Acts 16, verses 13 and 14, on the Sabbath we went out of the city by a riverside, where prayer was wont to be made, and we sat down and spake unto the women which resorted thither. So on this particular occasion, they were in a town or city where there was no Jewish synagogue. But as we read earlier, Paul's custom was to keep the Sabbath, whether there was a synagogue or not. And so he found a quiet place down by the river and was not just worshiping all alone. He saw some others there and he shared some things with them. And a certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple of the city of Thyatira, which worshiped God, heard us, whose heart the Lord opened, that she attended unto the things which were spoken of Paul. So they got a convert that day. This woman, Lydia, as she listened to the preaching and the teaching on that Sabbath day, she recognized right away this is from God. And she accepted and became a great blessing to the apostles while they were there in that town. But the key point is there was no synagogue, and they still kept the Sabbath day. Now we go to Corinth in Acts 18, verses 4 to 11. He, meaning Paul, reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and as we read the story, you'll see every Sabbath till he got thrown out. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. And when they opposed themselves and blasphemed, he departed thence and entered into a certain man's house named Justus, one that worshipped God, whose house joined hard to the synagogue. So when he got thrown out of the Jewish synagogue, there was a man who lived right next door, Justus. And he said, it's okay, you can come and preach in my house. And as a result, and Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his house, and many of the Corinthians hearing believed and were baptized. Now he continued preaching there for quite some time, it says, and he continued there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. So every Sabbath, right next to the synagogue, he was preaching on Sabbath, not on Sunday, but on Sabbath he was preaching for a year and a half because the work at Antioch went really to a lot of people. They had a very strong church established there, so he kept working a long time there. Now there's a text that gets perverted, but we're going to look at it. Acts 20, verse 7 and then verse 11. And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, now this means they were going to have communion service, and so someone says, aha, they had communion on Sunday. But you know what? In those days, they were so happy to celebrate communion, they did it on any day. It wasn't trying to set up a day of worship because of breaking bread on Sunday. And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, so that was one of their purposes, to get together, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight. So in other words, this was also a farewell because Paul was going to be leaving. They wanted, before he left, to be able to have this communion service. And just like happens today, I'm sure people came from all around to join them for this special event. Now, we're not going to read the whole story. You know about it. Eutychus was sitting in the window. He fell out of the window and he died. But God blessed, and Paul was used to resurrect him to life again. And so they brought him back upstairs. When he therefore was come up again and had broken bread and eaten and talked a long while, how long did he talk? Even till break of day. So he departed. So basically, except for the excitement of this death and the privilege of breaking bread and having the communion service, he preached the whole night. Now, in those days, and it should be now, but it's not, the days started at sundown, not at midnight. You can see that very clearly in the creation story. It always says in the evening and the morning were the first day. Evening and the morning were the second day, and so on. And the Sabbath in the Old Testament clearly was from even to even. God says it over and over again. So, this was not on the Sabbath, unless they started before sun went down. I don't know when they started, doesn't say. But the majority of this meeting was at night, after the sun went down, which would begin the first day of the week after the sun went down. So the farewell meeting then took all night on Sunday. Hardly an example for starting a new practice. Because if that was to be followed, we would have to get together Saturday night and have our worship services during the night. And not only that, but Paul was not preaching in the daylight part of Sunday. He was traveling. He was working. He was, going, walking. He didn't even go on the ship. He let them go on the ship and he walked. And so this is greatly misunderstood as giving any evidence of a change. Now again, we look at a couple of texts about what is important to the Christian. Here's what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 7:19. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. It's like saying, it doesn't matter if you're a Jew or if you're a Gentile. It doesn't matter. There's something else that matters, though. But the keeping of the commandments of God. That, he says, is important. Whether you keep it as a Jew or you keep it as a Gentile, doesn't matter. But the keeping of the commandments is very important. And in 1 John 2:4, he that saith, I know him, and keepeth not his commandments, is a liar, and the truth is not in him. Now, there are people that have been confused on this issue. There are people that really believe what their leaders tell them is true. And so I don't think God is calling them a liar if they have a personal relationship with Jesus. But at some point, God is going to inform them about what we're studying today. Because this message of returning to Sabbath keeping is a worldwide message. And when he does inform them, if they say, I don't want to worship on Sabbath, I don't want to keep that day holy, even though I can see that that's what the Bible says, and yet they still want to call themselves a Christian, God says, no, you're not a Christian, you're lying. That's pretty strong language. Another powerful evidence of the Sabbath is in Matthew 24, verses 2 and 3. Jesus said, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And he's talking about the temple. Talk about people's mouths dropping open. The disciples thought, this is indestructible. How can this be? The disciples came unto him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? They thought there's only one thing that could cause not one stone to be left on another, and that is the second coming of Jesus, when the whole world is turned upside down and becomes a pile of rubbish and nothing is on top of the other. That's what they thought. Well, Jesus kind of surprised them by telling them, no, it does mean that, all right, but it also means something else, the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, as you go through Matthew 24, there's a whole lot of things that he shares, but I just draw our attention to one. He says, "Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains." In other words, when the destruction of Jerusalem was going to take place, he said, if you live in Judea, you better clear out. But he's also saying, when the end of the world comes and all the disasters take place at the end of the world, you better flee to the mountains. But here's what else he said. "But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day." So that means that Jesus was addressing 70 AD, when the destruction of Jerusalem would take place, and he is expecting his followers to be keeping the Sabbath in 70 AD. He was resurrected in 33, and so he's looking 40 years practically down the line, and he gives no evidence. Now he would have to say to them, even though he hadn't died yet, he would have to say to them, in 70 AD, I expect you to be keeping Sunday in honor of my resurrection. But he didn't. Instead, he said, ask me to protect you so that you don't have to run on the Sabbath. Can you imagine what kind of Sabbath that would be if you had to be fleeing for your life and so on? So he said, pray. And I really believe we need to pray that today. But also, Jesus spoke of the events just before his second coming, which means Jesus was expecting his followers to be keeping the seventh-day Sabbath just before he would come back to this earth. So this one is very powerful in establishing that the Sabbath keeps on going all through the New Testament. Now there's another one that no attention is paid to. In Revelation 14, we have a three angels message that is to go into all the world. You heard the text this morning. And part of what is to go to all the world is in verse 7, where it says, worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of waters. Now, if you check that out with the fourth commandment, you'll see that it is a quotation from the fourth commandment. In Exodus 20, verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea. Doesn't mention the fountains of waters there, but it mentions those three. Made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is. And rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Therefore, when Jesus gave that angel's message to John, he was expecting that we would pick up on the fact that this is asking for the Sabbath to be kept. That a tremendous movement had taken place to rob people of their understanding of the Sabbath, and that now was the time for them to return to Sabbath keeping. We also see this in Revelation 12:17. And the dragon, which is the devil, was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed. And why is the devil so angry with the last piece of God's church, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ? They keep all 10. They don't say, like some do, we only need to keep 8 commandments. They don't say we should keep 9. This group of people say all 10 should be kept, and the devil is really angry because he hates that day to be used in the worship of God. And then again, it says it in Revelation 14:12. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. In this text, he's looking at a group of people that are commandment keepers, plus these other things as well. And as he watches them, he sees that they keep the commandments. All 10 of them are kept by him. And the final one that I will give you this morning is in Hebrews 8, verse 10. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts. And I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. Here, Jesus is making a very precious promise. He's saying the old covenant doesn't really work. You know, human beings can promise, I'll do it all, Lord. I will obey you. But human beings can't do that by themselves. And so God says, I want to make a new covenant with you. And the reason it says after those days is after Jesus dies on the cross, he wants to make that covenant. Now, it existed in the Old Testament too, under the heading of everlasting covenant. Many don't know that. There's 2 covenants in the Old Testament, not just one. But he's talking here that after Jesus comes to earth and dies and is resurrected, he wants to make a new covenant, and the new covenant doesn't do away with the law, but it puts the law inside our hearts so that when we obey it, we're doing it because we want to. We're doing it through his power because he wrote it in there. Now, do you think that Jesus is going to write only 9 of the 10 commandments in our heart? No, he doesn't say that. And so he's going to write all 10 commandments, which means he's going to write in our hearts a love of keeping the seventh-day Sabbath, which is the 4th commandment. So rather than the New Testament being empty of evidence about Sabbath keeping, we find that the New Testament is just about as explicit as the Old Testament is. Doesn't give all the details, doesn't repeat every word of the 4th commandment in any one particular place, but it gives adequate evidence. And I have discovered from my study the exact same thing is true of tithing. He does not fully expound on tithing because he expects people to get the understanding of tithing from the Old Testament and the understanding of the Sabbath from the Old Testament. And all he has to make plain is it's still there, and therefore God is calling us to keep it. So may all of us, hopefully, be better equipped to be able to help people when they are mixed up on that idea that the New Testament does not underscore the seventh-day Sabbath. It is clear, probably more clear than some of the other commandments in the New Testament, because it is a very important one, and God never changes. He never has to change the day of worship. I didn't put this in, but we have a text in Isaiah 66 that the Sabbath will still be in effect when we get to heaven, and when we get back down to the new earth, it's going to be still in place. And so God never has changed the day of worship. One other thing I'll mention, I didn't put it in, but there is a power that claims they did it, and that's the Roman Catholic Church. They basically say, God gave us the power to change it, and we have changed it. If you think they had the power, I guess you would go along with what they say. But they also say something else. I have 2 quotes. They say, if you want to follow the Bible, you better be a Seventh-day Adventist. And so in that part, I agree with them. That I think that's the answer, because they're not going to change. No matter how much evidence is given, they're not going to change. They consider that a mark of their authority, that they have changed the day of worship to Sunday.